on another occasion. As you're no doubt all aware, there's clearly a lot of regulatory change going on various subjects in our environment. GDPR will be coming into play in nearly 10 days' time, more than just over 10 days' time. And clearly that's going to change a lot of things in our industry. And IAB Europe, amongst others, have been doing a lot of work trying to find a way of helping our industry to manage that process. So we're delighted today to welcome Townsend Fuchman from IAB Europe, along with Julia Shullman, who's the Deputy General Counsel for Commercial and Privacy at AppNexus, and Charlie Simon, who's the Policy and Product Privacy Manager at MediaMath, to give us an overview of the work that they've been putting together in trying to create this consent, transparency and control mechanism that will hopefully help our industry deal with the challenges and opportunities that GDPR is going to bring. So my role today is as the chair of the Media Agencies Council for EACA, purely to introduce and hand over to the guys at IAB Europe. And I'll do that in 1 second. Just one other housekeeping point before I do that, or a couple of points. I think, if I'm right, the presentation is probably going to be in the region of 20 to 30 minutes, give or take. But what we would ask you is that if anyone has any questions, then feel free to either use the chat box bottom left of the webinar screen for those of you that are on Skype. Feel free to use that to submit any questions that you might have. Similarly, as we've a relatively small and tightly knit audience of 20 people or so, feel free to just pipe up with questions. Again, ideally, it would be best to wait until the end of the presentation, but I feel you have a really burning question that warrants then free to do so. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Townie in the first instance, and over to you, Townie.
Okay, so here's the agenda, and I will just I'll just pass along to Julia. Do flag on the chat box if you're having any trouble hearing. I hear a tiny bit of background noise, but not much. So Julia, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. As we said, late in the afternoon in Europe. I'm actually in London today, so I'm also, it's been a long week, so I'm sure we're all tired. So this is exactly what you wanted at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So we'll make this as brief and concise as possible, and we'll leave a lot of time for questions. So let me kick this off quickly. I'm gonna go through the ad tech landscape overview and really just talk generally about the issues that EU regulatory challenges and options that we face in this industry, particularly with GDPR and e-privacy. I'm going to address the challenges that we see and what we did to put in place the standardized framework, and quickly talk through the framework goals and some FAQs. And then Charlie is going to take over and go through quickly some of the technical specifications. Townie, I'm not sure, there's a decent amount of background noise on this, so maybe if anyone who's not muted could mute. I'm hearing a lot of background. Is that better?
Yeah.
All right, well, here we go.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. And maybe you can mute too, I don't know if it's you. All right, so slide 3 and slide 4. I'll very quickly run through these. These are just designed to show the data flows, very basic, from the sell side and the buy side of an ad call. So a user shows up on a website, how that impression might get sent through the ecosystem and the various parties that may receive data from a web page or from a device. And then on the buy side, on slide 4 here, we're looking at how marketers may collect data about their constituents, either directly through a retailer or from a web page or from a device. And let's talk about the challenges that these pose under the GDPR and e-privacy. So when we started looking at data flows throughout the ecosystem and issues that publishers brought up to us, that we ourselves saw, and that advertisers brought up to us as well. I think the top ones were data leakage. So again, this is mostly from the sell side, but in terms of when a user shows up on a website and an impression gets passed through various parties in the ecosystem, how many parties actually touched that user data, and whether publishers even knew who those parties were. Lack of control and transparency over the partners and demand sources on the page, on the publisher side, and on the advertiser side, lack of control and transparency into the various partners that receive data before an advertiser has the opportunity to bid on an impression. Townie, there's still a ton of feedback here. Is there anything that we could do?
On this Skype, I have no way of muting everybody. Can everybody who's listening please mute himself? So I'm sorry.
Okay. No. I think we've actually just finally got some clarity, and I apologize to everyone on the phone that the audio has been terrible. All right, so we're still on current challenges here. So privacy policies, as you think about the GDPR and its requirements, technically anyone who is accessing a device or a page or any controller downstream needs to be disclosed to an end user, and they need to be disclosed. The various purposes for which they're using data needs to be disclosed. There are other requirements under Articles 13 and 14 of the GDPR. And every single platform and every single advertiser actually has different privacy policies. So how is that actually handled in an ecosystem where there are tens or hundreds, occasionally even thousands of parties involved in a transaction? I already mentioned e-privacy. In almost all jurisdictions, in terms of how the e-privacy directive has been implemented today, any party needs consent to access a device. That includes controllers and processors. GDPR requirements we've already discussed, and then just generally continued monetization. Publishers still want to be paid for the space that they make available to advertisers on their pages, and advertisers want to make sure that they're reaching the audiences that they want to reach and that their campaigns are delivering. So we thought through on slide 6 potential options to handle these issues. So there's the option of going to a closed ecosystem, working with one or just two parties. That could help control data leakage. That could lend itself to a single privacy policy to the extent consent is necessary under the privacy directive or under GDPR, make it easier to obtain that. Could make it easier for GDPR compliance because there's less partners in that ecosystem. But there's major challenges to that. Control over data reporting, particularly for advertisers. How do you actually get access to user-level data that you need to ensure that your campaigns have properly delivered, to ensure that you can handle reporting back into your own systems? Control over third-party partners, I think this is one that publishers really see. They have other partners that they want to work with in the ecosystem, and if they just go and work with a closed ecosystem, they've now cut off a number of those partners, and that leads to the next issue, which is control over demand. That could actually dry up their demand sources, and maybe in the short term could lead to greater monetization, but over the long run, they have now put their business into the hands of one party. So instead, we stepped back as an industry and thought, all right, let's come up with a standard framework that will allow the entire ecosystem, publishers, advertising technology providers, advertisers, data providers, to all step back, dictate the policy that they want to apply in situations like this, and actually provide technical specifications that everyone can rely on. And the framework was designed to provide transparency for consumers and publishers into partners that actually monetize sites and apps, provide control for publishers over the partners that actually operate on their sites and apps, and the partners that can actually receive the data of their users and process that. Trust for advertisers, that the users they want to reach and that they are reaching through their campaigns have received the appropriate transparency, have received appropriate choice, and have provided consent where it's needed. Most importantly, control for consumers. This is the intent of the GDPR over how their personal data is actually used and by which third parties. The framework provides for consent as a potential legal basis. I also don't see it here, but it does provide for legitimate interest. There are various parties in the ecosystem that do very different things with data. Their platforms operate differently. And so there are parties that do believe they can rely on legitimate interest for specific purposes for which they're using data. Standardization. It allows publishers and partners, including advertisers, to operate and communicate efficiently using a single open source standard so that everyone knows which partners have been approved to receive data, how they can use that data. It provides flexibility for publishers and demand sources to build or work with various consent management providers. I will get into details about what this means. And it's designed to minimize disruption on the internet, which is supposed to benefit consumers, publishers, and supporting companies, including advertisers. Now, I do want to emphasize on this last point, when we all started looking, again, at the GDPR, the interplay with e-privacy, and what this really meant for the ecosystem, we spent a lot of time talking to our clients, publishers, advertisers, partners in the ecosystem. I think we all acknowledged and agreed that the ecosystem is ripe for disruption, and it is not a bad thing if status quo is not maintained, and this framework is not meant to maintain status quo. It is meant to provide control back to publishers, control to advertisers. It is not meant to allow the, frankly, tough ad tech ecosystem and a lot of times not very transparent ad tech ecosystem to continue to operate as it was. We know that there's going to be disruption, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. All right, so on slide 8, we've gone through a lot of this already, but the framework was designed for accountability, transparency, and control. It's supposed to allow publishers and advertisers where they decide to leverage it to demonstrate compliance. It's designed to provide an auditable trail throughout the ecosystem as to which providers were approved by a publisher, who received data, how they were allowed to use it, and who they passed it on to, transparency into the companies, their purposes, their different legal bases, and control. On slide 9, it is absolutely designed for flexibility for different business models. Again, there are 6 legal bases that a company can rely on if they're a controller to process personal data. We recognize and agree that there are different interpretations of what it means to be compliant and what it means to provide transparency, notice, and choice and obtain consent in different markets. Even though the GDPR was designed to provide a standard across Europe, different DPAs have different interpretations. And our clients do not want to have one single standard across different markets right now. Again, consent and legitimate interest are the most relevant legal bases, and it supports various different compliance regimes. Slide 10, it does support legitimate interest, as I mentioned. I will not get into a lot of detail here, but again, even if a vendor is relying on legitimate interest to process personal data, they still have transparency requirements under the GDPR, particularly Articles 13 and 14. Users need to be provided with transparency, and they need to be given a choice of opting out. So this framework does support that use case. It obviously supports consent, and we all acknowledge what consent means. It does require an unambiguous and affirmative act. Companies who rely on consent need to be disclosed by name. This is what we've heard from various regulators and the Article 29 Working Party guidance. The purposes of processing must be disclosed at a granular level. We'll get into it in a moment, but the framework does provide for standard purposes, but they are way more granular than just providing personalized advertising. And companies must be able to demonstrate that they have a valid consent if they were relying on consent under the GDPR. So this provides for an auditable trail for those companies. On slide 12, again, e-privacy directive. The framework provides for the ability to also comply with e-privacy requirements. In almost all jurisdictions, consent is necessary to store or access information on a user's device. The definition of consent under the e-privacy directive actually points to the existing data protection directive of 95, which will be updated to become the GDPR in 2 weeks. So slide 13, let's talk about where we actually landed. So where we landed is a standard framework that Charlie will explain in greater detail that has 4 components to it, 3 of which are centrally managed, and I'll get into what that means in a second, and 1 of which is decentralized. So I usually like to start in the lower left-hand corner here with the global vendor list that is being maintained by IAB Europe, Townie and her team. And what it is a standardized list where vendors, so anyone in the ad tech ecosystem, can come and sign up, and they can tell the ecosystem based on 5 standard purposes, which purposes they are collecting and using data for. Again, if they're only a processor, the only purpose is the e-privacy access to a device or browser purpose. They can provide a link to their privacy policy. They will disclose which legal basis they are relying on. They will be given a unique vendor ID. And that list then becomes available to a publisher or to an advertiser who is deciding that they want to hit that central list to provide standardized disclosures to end users showing up on their sites, on their apps, on any other medium on which they are providing any sort of advertising. So then we go up to the upper left-hand corner here, user interface. That is decentralized. That is what we call a consent management platform. That is when a user shows up on a site and they are shown an interstitial, or they are shown what today is known as a cookie banner. That is something that a publisher or an advertiser who is using a CMP on one of its landing pages or sites to collect data will use to interact with a user. And that user interface can be custom designed by a publisher. A publisher can work with a what I note as a for-profit company like an Evidon or OneTrust. They can customize the language that is shown to a user in that. And what is so great about this is underlying that user interface, the various vendors that a publisher has decided to allow to access their users' devices or to receive personal data in a request to fill an ad in the programmatic landscape will be pulled from that global vendor list dynamically. So no longer does a publisher have to go out to every single one of its SSPs, its DSPs, and let's talk about this and what it means for advertisers. The advertisers that are using those DSPs and the various vendors they are using, from buy-side ad servers, measurement providers, you name it, publishers don't have to go to all of those various vendors and ask them for their privacy policies and ask them what legal basis they're relying on and get all of that information. They get to just go directly to the global vendor list dynamically and pull all of that information in, show it to a user, and the user has choice over those vendors. User can give consent where it needs to, user has the choice to opt out where it needs to, and user can see all of those different vendors and the various purposes for which they're collecting data. Once the user has interacted with that user interface, we go down to the lower right-hand corner, which is the technical standard framework. That technical standard framework today is similar to the OpenRTB. It's a standard protocol that is used throughout the industry to save the publisher and the user's choices in a standard format that Charlie will get into. And that standard format is then passed throughout the ecosystem so that every party knows who the publisher has chosen to approve and what the user's choices have been. The last piece of this framework is the framework policies, which currently sit at IAB Europe. And the long-term goal, which is we are planning on doing very, very shortly, is to create a governance structure there that includes the entire online advertising ecosystem, from publishers to ad tech providers to advertisers to agencies, data providers, you name it. And the framework policies govern the sign up to that global vendor list, standards that a user interface needs to comply with, standards that CMPs need to comply with, and how to use that technical standard framework. So on slide 14, there's also a few updates that we are making to the framework. So publishers now have even more control. On the 2nd of May, we opened up a public consultation where there is now a something similar to ads.txt, which is a JSON file that lives on every domain that will allow publishers to control even more granularly the partners that they use and the purposes for which they use personal data. And it actually provides a great way for everyone in the ecosystem to be able to interrogate regularly each site and to make sure that that site is complying with the policies. Slide 15, there's also mobile in-app support on the way. Also, a 30-day public consultation was opened on the same day as the pubvendor.json, and that framework can be used today, but again, it's still open to public comment. Getting into slides 16 and 17, common FAQs that we hear, and I'm sorry I'm rushing, but I want to hand this over to Charlie and then open up the floor for questions. Why does this framework actually matter for advertisers, and why should advertisers pay attention? So I think the big thing is this concept of connectivity in the ecosystem. Publishers need to list advertisers' vendors as approved vendors on their sites. Otherwise, advertisers' demand will not reach their supply. That is a key thing. So when a publisher lists its vendors on its in its CMP, that needs to include any vendor throughout the ecosystem that gets to access a user's device or receives personal data. That includes buy-side ad servers. Also, for pixels that are firing on advertiser sites, advertisers will need a means to provide transparency and consent to those users and to pass that information along many times. So ideally, the framework would be used for that as well. Some other questions we get are, do publishers have to facilitate transparency and consent for all vendors on that global vendor list? Absolutely not. Publishers can control which vendors they want to work with. They pick those vendors, and those vendors are dynamically pulled into their user interface. Does the framework only support what's called global, otherwise known as web-wide consent? So once the publisher surfaces a vendor on its page and a user makes a choice about that vendor, is that choice applicable to a vendor across the web forever? Knowing that a lot of us use cookies that are user-specific and not publisher-specific? Absolutely not. The framework supports what we denote as service-specific, so just site-specific, group-specific. So if a publisher group wanted to obtain consent across all of its sites, it could do that, and then a global transparency and consent option. And each publisher can configure its site to support one of the three options here. Some other common FAQs is, does the framework support different purposes for different vendors? So the current iteration does not, but this pubvendors.json update, which is in public consultation and can be used by publishers, it's just not out of the consultation period yet, does support publishers controlling purposes by vendor. And this is a big one. That was a big thing for publishers. This means that they don't have to allow every vendor in the ecosystem to be able to, for example, use their user data to create interest-based segments that they can use across all of their clients. Another question we get asked is, who maintains the pieces of the framework? And I already went into this. The IAB Europe currently maintains policy and the global vendor list. Tech Lab maintains the technical framework. If anyone in the ecosystem wants to get involved at either of these levels, please reach out to IAB Europe or the Tech Lab. There are working groups, there are boards, there are commit groups. They are open to anyone and everyone. And again, IAB Europe very soon will be spinning up conversations with very important industry organizations to ensure that all of those industry organizations have a seat at the table in order to impact and make decisions over policy. All right, that was a lot. I am now going to hand the floor to Charlie to quickly go into a technical overview of the framework.
Thanks much, Julia. So hi, I'm Charlie. I'm with MediaMath, where I work on both the policy and the product teams to implement, amongst other things, the transparency and consent framework. As Julie mentioned, the framework facilitates the transmission of consent signals and potentially legitimate interest signals through the RTBs or protocol, the Open RTB protocol. And the gist there is that we have this foundation for the interaction, the complicated interaction. I just lost the connection. Is everyone still on?
Yeah, we can still hear you.
We can hear you fine. It's a little echoey, your voice, Charlie.
I apologize for that. I am in a room that is apparently less than optimal.
It's all right. No problem.
So yeah, diving back into that. From a technical standpoint, what we really wanted to do and what we've accomplished is an augmentation of existing technology. The OpenRTB stack is already extremely complex, as you can see from slide 19. And so we wanted to make the acquisition, transmission, and sort of resultant bit ops as simple as possible and as layered as possible. So to that extent, from a technical standpoint, what we've done is we've created an industry-wide list of vendors who are all bound to standard protocols and policies, specifically the ones that Julie discussed. And they will all be able to read the signals allocated to them via standardized mechanisms for requiring, storage and consent. This includes things like a standard JavaScript API, standardized CMP technologies and reference frameworks, and data structures, which I'll get into for sure, that allow the sort of granular transmission between parties of consent signals for various purposes. And as Julie mentioned, all of this is open sourced and transparent. So moving right along, one of the sort of three pillars of this technology is a standardized industry vendor list. To that end, IV Europe and the participants in the framework have developed what is essentially a registration table that allows companies to be granted individual IDs and to declare their purposes and to declare the legal bases by which they will operate. This list, which is versioned for audit purposes, allows publishers to sort of pick and choose the partners they wish to work with, and it allows advertising technology companies in the bid stream to understand the consent states of multiple different parties in real time. So moving to slide 22. The real underpinning here is that the framework supports the granting of consent and the requesting of it. While the framework is not prescriptive from a implementation standpoint, right, the actual GUI, graphical user interface that would collect these consents at a granular level, it does standardize the JavaScript that must be leveraged in order to allow publishers and their CMPs, consent management platform partners, to get the consents. So it ensures that the vendor list is leveraged. The standardized JavaScript ensures that the vendor list is leveraged in an accurate and up-to-date fashion. It eliminates for the complexities of sort of advertising technology companies going on a one-to-one basis to interact with publishers. And it allows for an identification mechanism and a bid string mechanism that can transmit in real time the consent states for all partners in the ecosystem. So slide 23 is a solid example and is only an example of how a user might interact on a publisher page when presented with this CMP. The gist being that they would be presented with the purposes for which the publisher and the parties the publisher would like to operate will be collecting and processing data. And it allows for potentially very granular consent around the purposes that the consumer would allow. So moving to slide 24, the big issue here is how do we store these consent signals? And the answer is it's complicated, but it is standardized. Two mechanisms are needed, the sort of identification piece to identity and the persistence piece, which is sort of critical to not destroying the user experience, right? Not popping the CMP multiple times across multiple sites if the publisher's implementation is designed in that way. So from an identification standpoint, there are really a lot of options available to us. As Julia mentioned, the CMPs, depending on what the publisher wishes, will facilitate potentially site-specific consent signals around partners and purposes that publisher would want. It could also facilitate publisher-wide multi-site type mechanisms, and the sort of the holy grail of all this is that it supports a namespace that IAB Europe has designated for web-wide consent. And in order to sort of operate to the extent that we can and want to fully across the European landscape, the web-wide consent aspect is critical. So we will leverage existing technologies like cookies, like mobile SDKs, certain kinds of login alliances, and centralized registries to continue storing those consents. This is not necessarily a complete shift in the way both agencies, advertisers, publishers, and everyone else in between operate. The key to making sure that the GUI is representative of the work being done in the framework is transmitting the consent, which, as I said, while complicated, is totally standardized and works with the OpenRTB protocol. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, sorry. My signal dropped again. So the gist here is that we have a lot of potential participants in the ecosystem, and publishers may wish to work with some, and depending on the interactions that of the consumer around complicating or granular choice, there has to be a method by which everyone in the bid stream from the point at which the CMP compiles it to the SSP and exchanges and DSPs further upstream can all understand the states for which their potential partners might play. To that end, what we've built is effectively a bitmap-like structure that I often refer to as the DAISY bit, but many refer to as the consent string. And moving to slide 26, what that consent string does, while it looks complicated, is it actually facilitates the surfacing of each vendor, potentially up to thousands, though those would not ever be surfaced to an individual consumer, to have positions giving granular states, including which specific purposes the vendors would use, to be transmitted in a compressed form upstream. 27 gives a better graphical representation of this, right? A walkthrough of the composite of the composing of the payload, which everyone will be reading, is something like I, Charlie, visit Adidas, right? Or actually, a better example would be the Guardian. And the Guardian, say, pops a CMP. It instantiates that banner-like CMP that we have a GUI for, and it asks me to grant them and their partners various purposes, including, say, the collection and use of data for purposes of facilitating targeted advertising on their website. So then the CMP, having taken my interactions with it, will compile the interactions and their sort of granular choice methodologies into this compressed bit string and send it upstream. So it could, for instance, then signal several SSPs that various parties upstream of them have been consented to for the necessary purposes of, say, serving that ad to me. And the SSPs can then say, they can read that string and then say, several exchanges have been authorized, or several rather DSPs have been authorized, but several others have not. And in so doing, in real time, they can solicit the DSPs for bids, and the DSP advertisers can bid in a sort of faithful fashion that allows for auditability. So what do these things enable? What does this complicated looking but actually rather sophisticated and simple technology enable? It enables, as Julie mentioned, control by over vendors as enabled by publishers and their CMPs. It allows for, and this is really key, I think, across the entire landscape, given the import of transparency and understanding by consumers in the process of giving valid consent. It allows for transparency about every sort of advertiser technology company that is potentially going to be involved in serving those ads on those publisher sites, allowing the monetization. It provides the audit trail. So everyone in the stream that encounters the DAISY bit will have a copy of it, right? And what that means is that participants will have to both abide by it and potentially be audited against it, allowing for everyone in this group to be participating in good faith and facilitating requirements under the GDPR for auditability. And finally, and this is the really important part, is this is about enabling a better web experience. It's about facilitating the wishes of the publishers and, more importantly, the wishes of the consumers on websites, such that getting consent under the GDPR or surfacing the notices under the GDPR doesn't prove an onerous and repetitive process. So we're listening to everyone. We're listening to agencies. We're listening to publishers. We are listening to fellow advertising technology companies, those who are in the bid string and those who are outside of it, like segment providers, and we're integrating that feedback. While versions via Tech Lab have already been iterated and companies are integrating against them, just as MediaMath and AppNexus have, we are still honing this framework. There is work to be done, and there will be work to be done after May 25, which means that you have a chance to voice what you believe is essential to this framework. And we would really like you to do so. And with that, I'll leave it to the endorsement slides on slide 30 and open this up to questions.
Thank you very much, Charlie and Julia. Great presentation. I think you did an excellent job at trying to simplify an extremely complex and technical subject. So really appreciate that. I just want to see whether, I don't know how many people that are still on the call are able to engage verbally, but if you are, feel free to put your hand up and ask a question directly. I haven't seen any come through via the chat box, so I guess now would be the moment to ask any specific questions if anyone has any. I'll just leave that there for a second. Okay, well, whilst you're thinking, if anyone does have any questions, then obviously do shout. But whilst you're thinking, it would be interesting to just hear kind of what the initial feedback has been from the tool now that it's started to go live, and kind of what stage you're at and how you see this rolling out over the coming weeks and months. Is that something that one of you could elaborate upon?
Sure. Okay, so it's rolled out, which is very exciting, and it's taken a lot of work from a lot of ad tech partners, from agency trading desks, from collaboration with a lot of big European publishers. So the technical specifications are live. Those are open. We have various CMPs that are either available to be used or finalizing their integrations with the technical specifications. We have a lot of signups to the global vendor list, and we are still driving through various publishers and advertisers sign up as they look through the various vendors that they work with and realize that they need to get those vendors signed up. And we have, a lot of us in the ad tech ecosystem finishing up touches on our platforms to ensure that we can ingest these signals and actually run auctions based on these signals. So I think the uptick has been really, really positive, and I think it's, as you said, it's a complicated framework because it's a complicated ecosystem, unfortunately. But it is very much designed so that the ecosystem as a whole can take control and can decide, what policy should underlie the framework and how it should be used, so that that policy and those technical specifications aren't dictated by one party in the ecosystem. Because as we all know, that's just not something that we want. We want to make sure that our publishers and our advertisers and ourselves can really work together and make sure that all of these EU regulatory requirements, from the GDPR to the existing e-privacy directive to potentially the e-privacy regulation, can be handled by the industry. So we're really excited, and we're just pushing ahead.
Very good.
And I think that Julia is absolutely right across the board. But this framework, and it's important to realize that it's flexible. It will evolve with our understanding of the law, with the emergence of new parties that wish to participate, with publisher feedback, with consumer feedback, and that's a really good and important thing, and it gives you the opportunity to interact with us and influence the way it evolves.
Okay, thank you for that. And
John?
in terms of the, sorry, go ahead.
I was just thinking, after the webinar, we can send around some of the links to the documents. The colleagues mentioned open consultations that are going to run till the 1st of June on this pub vendors JSON and the in-app, the mobile implementation, and it would be lovely to have EACA members, just have a noodle through those and come back with some feedback. We're also doing some outreach to DPAs rather cautiously, just sort of socializing it and starting, getting a little bit of feedback, and we'll be assimilating that going forward too. So it's there's going to be a lot of things in motion for a while. We have about 165 vendors signed up right now. We have some important publisher endorsements too, and but there will be lots of opportunities to contribute to the reflection process and influence it going forward.
Great. So in terms of the regulators and the DPAs, as you say, the data protection authorities, I mean, have you had any feedback yet? Have you had much engagement with them?
So we've had a meeting with the Irish DPA, and we have appointments to meet 2 other DPAs, and we're trying to organize a meeting with the CNIL. So we have appointments with the UK and Norway, I think. And just sort of sharing all of the reflection and process, and why we cut things a certain way, why we took certain decisions, where we erred in our view on the side of more transparency and more control for the user, and what the thinking process was. And we've gotten some interesting feedback, some questions both about the way we've defined the purposes, which, as Julia said, are quite granular. And although there are arguments in favor of there's a trade-off between granularity and assimilability or comprehensibility, understandability. So really, I think I wasn't at the first conversation with the Irish DPA, but it seemed to have been really interesting and a lot of food for thought. And we need to, so that the position is we're going in and sharing and looking for thinking and feedback, but it's not a code of conduct or something that we are expecting to formalize into some sort of approved tool yet. That may be something we get to, but.
Sure. And what about in the corridors of Brussels? Has it been received positively? I mean, I'd like to think it has been, but what have you heard so far?
I actually haven't done too much discussion of it. with Commission folk here. We're going to meet the European Data Protection Supervisor, have a conversation with the EDPS at Interact, and we will have a couple of NEPs there also. We are, so there's been a little bit less, probably less outreach to the Commission, just because of sort of who's going to be more immediately concerned, because I guess now we are in this enforcement phase. And but there was a really fairly positive initial feedback from civil society, which was sort of fun. So when the first information came out, and we did we did an informal consultation that we invited EACA and some of the other EU level associations to participate in February, and before the broader public consultation on version 1.0 of the main standard. And there's been there was some nice positive feedback from civil society, but I think it's real sort of ongoing thing, and we're really in the go to market now, and just trying to evangelize it as much as we can amongst the people who need to implement it in, as you said, less than 2 weeks now, right? 2 weeks from today.
And in terms of the impact on internet users, consumers, and indeed agencies and advertisers, is the intent that this is very much in the background and that no one really needs to know that it exists? How visible is it going to be to the daily lives of both agency and advertising execs, as well as consumers or any of us that are using the internet?
It's a good question. I think users, the benefit of it hopefully is, and again, while publishers and advertisers, if this is on their landing page, we'll start to see more similarities, hopefully, in terms of the disclosures that are being made to them. And as they dig in and actually really try to understand for which purposes their data is being used and who the parties are behind there, this should be standardized across the web, which should help drive more clarity about our ecosystem. I think in terms of advertising execs, this is going to actually hopefully create a closer relationship between advertisers and their supply sources, because there really needs to be a matchup between the vendor lists. And I don't need to talk about other big partners in the ecosystem, but this is exactly what they're doing on their platform. This is matching up supply and demand and making sure any vendor that's called in that ecosystem is being disclosed to a user when a user shows up on a page. So it's a good thing, more transparency for the ecosystem and for consumers.
Absolutely, and hopefully in time that will also continue to build more trust in the whole digital ad ecosystem, which has certainly been a challenge in recent times. So it's got to be positive in that sense, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a hugely important part of this. And, you've got, I'm from AppNexus and Charlie's with MediaMath, so two of the larger independent advertising providers in the ecosystem. And again, I think we want to emphasize, we recognize that a lot of publishers and a lot of advertisers are taking this opportunity to take back control of their data and of the sources in the ecosystem that get to use that data or process it in the act of actually delivering an ad, and that's really important, and that's what our companies believe in.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to throw it back out there. Does anyone have any burning questions that's still with us that have not been discussed or covered so far? Clearly a very comprehensive job has been done. So thank you again to Julia and Charlie and Townie. I think we've got 5 minutes or so left. Is there anything else that any of you would like to say to sum up kind of the work that's been done so far, which as you noted, Julia, in particular, there's been a huge amount of effort taken from many stakeholders in the industry to get this initiative to where it is today. So, maybe you could just try and sum up where we've come from, where we've got to, and where you see this going, and we can wrap things up from there.
Hey, I'd just like to thank everyone. I'd just like to thank everybody who's joined the call. I think one of the more important realizations about this entire process is that we've worked really, really hard to get stakeholders from all aspects of the ecosystem to come to the table to make a better web experience for internet users. But to continue doing that, we really do need everyone to come to the table. And I think this is a solid opportunity for agencies and advertisers to reach out to IB Europe or me or Julia or anyone else that you know is participating and ask how you might influence this. We want your feedback, and I think for this to continue going forward in a positive fashion, we need it.
Yeah, and I think by feedback, we also mean, and I know Townie, is going to be working with industry groups. We want you all to have a seat at that table and be part of the decision making going forward. So that, frankly, so I can stop doing my second job, but also because it's so important. Like this is not going to benefit the ecosystem unless the ecosystem has a voice at that table and is helping drive an industry solution instead of getting stuck with a solution that's being dictated by a few parties in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think a cross-industry approach is crucial, and it needs to have the full endorsement of all stakeholders to be a credible long-term solution. And I think it has that, but having a continuous opportunity for dialogue, engagement, input will be a crucial part of that moving forward too. Townie, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I just slyly put up a little advertising for our annual conference Interact, which is taking place on the 23rd and 24th of May in Milan, and there'll be actually a whole slew of trainings of different kinds on GDPR, and notably one on the framework that will feature at least one of the speakers you heard today, Julia. And I am bound to, so there are the other sessions that have something to do with GDPR. And my colleague Colombe wanted me to remind you that EACA members benefit from a 20% discount that only our special friends have access to. And I can send you the exceedingly advantageous pricing. I can just tell you right now, it's only 650 euros with a 20% discount if you buy a ticket this week and say you know John Chase, and or next week. And think of it if you haven't already registered. Voila.
And definitely a packed and fascinating agenda beyond the world of GDPR and the consent framework. I know you've got a lot of things that will be very important and pertinent to discuss and cover and tell people about at your Interact conference. So, listen, thank you so much, Townie and Julia and Charlie. It's been a really interesting and very useful webinar. We'll definitely look forward to reviewing the recording and trying to digest some of the more technical elements of it as we move this whole framework forward. But we really appreciate all the efforts that you and many others have put into getting the industry to where it is in terms of this framework. And I think you've done a fantastic job, and it's certainly something that is really important for all of us in the industry, from the agency association and indeed agencies perspective. We fully support the efforts and would like to very much be involved in the conversations moving forward. So thank you all once again.
Thank you for the opportunity today.
2 minutes early, and thank you to all of you joining us and staying with us. We wish you all the very best for the weekend. Time to go home.
Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.